Why Israel and Palestine will never stop fighting. Judaism is quite old as a religion. Judaism started about 3,300 years ago with Abraham in about 1800 BCE. Therefore, the Jews who practice Judaism have been around for a long time. From that time in the Bible, there was no land called Israel. The Israelites were a people and they practiced a faith called Judaism. Now, never had a state called Israel. And we know from biblical records that the Jews were at one point exiled from the land of Judah, which was the land that was actually mostly occupied by the Jews. In 597 BCE, the land of Judah was under siege by King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Now, ancient Babylon is currently located in Iraq, and it's 50 miles south of modern-day Baghdad. So in 597 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid a siege on the kingdom of Judah. In the 4th year of the siege, the king of Judah refused to pay taxes to King Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore, King Nebuchadnezzar forced Jews to leave the land of Judah. Most of the Jews who were exiled from Judah went to live in places like Lebanon, modern Syria, Persia, which is now modern Iran, as well as Iraq and Jordan. Some also moved to the region of northern Israel of today. They were exiled until King Cyrus the Great of Persia allowed the Jews to return to Judah. Now, Persia is modern-day Iran. Therefore, it is actually ironical that the Jews were exiled by a king of Iraq, which at that time was called Babylon, and they were then allowed to return again to Judah by a king of Iran, which was then ancient Persia. It's interesting because the exile to Babylon was probably the first time that the Jews were forced to leave their land, which was then Judah or Judea. Modern day Judea or Judah is in the West Bank, which of course you guys know is controlled mostly by the Palestinian Authority with some occupiers from Israel. Like I said before, most of the exiled Jews from Judah settled in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran, or ancient Persia. Some, of course, returned to Judah. Now we can fast forward to the time of the Romans. The Romans ruled 1,000 years from 753 BCE to 476 CE. In that time, the Roman Empire spanned almost from west to east. In the year 63 BC, the Romans entered Jerusalem. Historians claim that the Romans named the land Palestine to distinguish it from its multiple previous occupants. The Arabs used to call Palestine Palestine, and of course the Jews claim today that that area called Palestine should be called the land of Israel. In 40 BCE, the Romans appointed King Herod as king of Judah, or king of Palestine, because this was now called Palestine. This is a very important point because this was probably the first time when the Palestinians can lay claim to having had a country called Palestine. Unfortunately, the country called Palestine was also occupied by Jews. Therefore, Jews and Arabs lived side by side in Palestine. In the Bible, we are all aware of the history of the Jews during the time of the Roman occupation of Palestine. Now, fast forward again to the 8th centuries in Europe. Now, like I said to you guys, the Jews had been exiled from Judah, but they also returned. Many who did not choose to return remained in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and of course they became Jewish citizens of those countries. But there was persecution of the Jews in Europe from 1095 onwards. The Jews were persecuted for several reasons. They were massacred in France, in England, in Russia, in Polish-controlled Ukraine, and of course in Germany. The Jews were blamed, of course, first and foremost for the death of Jesus Christ. So initially the Jews were actually persecuted because majority of the ancient world, which was ruled by the Romans, were Christians. Emperor Constantine of Rome, of course, converted to Christianity, and their Jews were also accused of blood libels, which is the ritual murder of Christian children. These allegations were never, of course, confirmed. Despite this, many Jews lost their lives in Europe. They were also blamed for the Black Death, which killed millions of Europeans. They were massacred in the 14th century because they were accused of poisoning the wells in Europe, which people believed caused the Black Death. Of course, now we know that the Black Death was caused by the plague and was not caused by the Jews poisoning wells. Around 2,000 Jews were massacred by burning in Strasbourg, modern-day France, on February 14th, 1349. Jews were also killed in Freiburg and Basel in Germany. The Jews also couldn't own land in Europe, and they were expelled from England in 1290 and expelled from France in 1306 and 1394. They were often blamed for the financial difficulties of nations because the kings would often borrow from the Jews, who were very good at commerce and often worked as bankers or moneylenders. In fact, sometimes the kings would concoct some allegations against the Jews and have them killed in order not to pay the debts they owed the Jews. The Cossack uprising in Polish-controlled Ukraine occurred in 1648, when tens of thousands of Jews were massacred, expelled, or sold as slaves. There were also pogroms against Jews in Russia in 1881 and after the First Russian Revolution of 1905, when thousands of Jews were killed. This, of course, sparked Jewish immigration to America. Don't forget the Holocaust. But the Holocaust, which occurred between 1941 to 1945, was perhaps the greatest calamity to befall the Jews. 6 million Jews were killed by Germans under the Nazi regime. Many Jewish survivors fled Europe and went to live in America. Of course, the Holocaust put pressure on the British and the West to support the call for a home nation for the Jews. But let's backtrack a little bit to 1917, which was when the British forces defeated the Ottoman Empire. The British convinced Arabs to fight against the Turks and promised to establish or allow the Arabs to establish their own Arab state if they could help the British defeat the Ottomans. Unfortunately, after this happened, the British did not fulfill their promise, and instead the British and French occupied Palestine. By 1917, a British diplomat declared support for a Jewish national home. This is the famous Balfour Declaration. By 1922, the League of Nations, which was formed after the First World War, issued a mandate for the British to control Palestine. This mandate for Palestine would last from 1920 to 1948. When the British controlled Palestine, there were definitely some concerns raised by the Arabs who saw the immigration of Jews into Palestine. Unfortunately, due to the persecution of the Jews in Europe, it appears that sentiments had shifted towards a support for a Jewish state. The Arabs had suggested to retain the name Palestine, or Palestine, which the Arabs called Palestine. The Jews wanted to call it Land of Israel. In the end, the British government stuck with Palestine, which is what the Europeans had always known it as since the Romans conquered Palestine. The British was in Palestine until 1948, when, due to multiple political upheavals and difficulties with the Arab neighbors of Israel, the British people left. As soon as they left, Israel declared a state of Israel. This was despite the fact that there were already about 800,000 Palestinians living in the region. The Jews, of course, coming from having been through the Holocaust of 1941 to 45, were adamant that they wanted to feel safe in their own land. They fought several wars, which includes the 1948 Palestinian War. They also fought again in 1967, the Six-Day War, following which they recovered the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and even the Sinai Peninsula. The Jews were able to negotiate with the Egyptians and returned the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians to secure peace with Egypt. Now, let's move forward to the 1990s. In 1993, the Oslo Accord was first established to help provide a self-governing state for the Palestinians in the Gaza and West Bank. The accord was supposed to see a gradual handover of the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, who were then deemed to be the true leaders of Palestine. Oslo II in 1995 also tried to continue the peace process to establish a two-state solution, one state for the Palestinian Arabs and one state for the Jews. Unfortunately, in 1995, radical Israeli assassinated Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. In 1996, Israel went to the polls and elected Benjamin Netanyahu, who was a very strong critic of the Oslo Accord. As you can see, the discontent and mistrust between Palestinians and the Israelis have been going on for quite some time. Fast forward to today, or fast forward to the 2000s. In 2006, Hamas, which Israel and America designates as a terrorist group, won elections in the Gaza Strip and therefore took control of Gaza. Mind you, Israel had vacated the Gaza Strip, which they had previously conquered in 1967. But after Hamas won the election in 2006, Israel chose to then blockade Gaza in 2007. The PLO continued to govern the West Bank, while Hamas kept on governing the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, it appears that Mr. Netanyahu may have had some viewed plot to encourage Hamas to continue to get stronger in order to justify his dislike of the Oslo Accord. In other words, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu did not seem to care that Hamas was threatening to destroy Israel. Recent information that has been passed on revealed that Mr. Netanyahu actually knew that Qatar and perhaps Iran were giving money to Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni organization, just like the majority Sunni Saudi Arabia, and Hamas has sworn to destroy Israel. The blockade of Gaza, of course, led to a lot of oppression by the Israelis, and this led to the October 7, 2023 attack of Hamas terrorists on Israeli civilians, killing 1,200 Israelis and taking about 240 Israelis captive as hostages. Of course, Israel retaliates for this terrorist attack with massive airstrikes, dropping 1,000 bombs per day in the first 6 days of the war. Israeli bombs and the mortars have so far killed up to 15,000 Palestinians, which includes women and children. Israel has justified this bombardment, claiming that they want to eliminate Hamas. But they seem to have thrown international law away and now are bombing civilians recklessly in what people have called collective punishment for the Palestinian people. Now, what can we learn from the Israel-Gaza conflict so far? An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, or at least most of the whole world. There is no justification for the killing of anyone except in self-defense. We have to ask ourselves, did Hamas attack Israel in self-defense? No. Was the Hamas attack an act of aggression? Yes. Was the Hamas attack justified? No, but there is a but. Because this is not where it ends. Although the attack is not justified, we have to look at the context and what led to the attack. Are Palestinians justified in seeing Israelis as occupiers and oppressors? Yes. Did the Hamas government in Gaza arise as a result of Israel's oppression of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank? Yes. Is the Hamas attack on October 7th therefore unprovoked? No. Even though the Hamas attack was a heinous crime against humanity, we cannot say that the attack was unprovoked. Going by the context of the decades of occupation and oppression by Israel. Now, is Israel's bombing of civilians in Gaza an act of self-defense? No. Israel has an iron dome which it uses to deflect rockets fired from Gaza. And yes, Hamas has been firing rockets at Israel for the past 30 days. And yes, some Israeli villages have been hit by Hamas rockets, but only a very small number of people have been killed in Israel because of Hamas rocket attacks. Israel can definitely defend themselves without dropping 6,000 bombs in 6 days on Gaza. Can Israel eliminate Hamas without dropping 6,000 bombs in Gaza in 6 days? Yes. Can Israel eliminate Hamas without targeting hospitals and residential buildings in Gaza? Yes. Is the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, carrying out war crimes in Gaza? Yes. Is the West repeating the mistakes it made when it persecuted and killed Jews for centuries in Europe? Yes. This time around, the West has switched around from persecuting Jews to enabling Jews perpetrate a genocide against Palestinians. Again, the rest of the world, the West in particular, watches and they do nothing. Just like they did during the Holocaust. In summary, this is what happens. This is what human beings do for self-preservation. Today, Palestinians are bearing the cost for the guilt and the sins of the West over their persecution of Jews in Europe for several centuries. The Jews are now being used to cleanse the guilt of the Germans, the Poles, the British, the French, and the Russians who massacred Jews in Europe for centuries. Perhaps the West enables Israel to kill Palestinians for fear of Muslims. Perhaps they fear Iran, and therefore they choose to turn a blind eye to the massacre of innocent women and children by Israeli bombs, by Israeli defense forces. Perhaps they wish to retain Israel as an ally in the Middle East to prevent future terrorist attacks by Islamic jihadists on American soil or on British soil. They therefore turn a blind eye, just like the Pope turned a blind eye and refused to condemn Hitler for the extermination of the Jews, because the Pope was more afraid of communism. In the same way, the Americans were also distrustful of communist Russia and waited to join the war until millions of Jews had been exterminated in Poland. Perhaps the fear of the unknown, or the fear of people who don't look like us, drives this madness. Perhaps the fear of people who don't worship the same gods as we do drives this madness. Just like it drove the English, the French, the Russians, the Germans to kill Jews in Europe over centuries. The same fear now drives Israelis to kill thousands in Gaza with impunity and with the support of the United States of America. When are we going to stop focusing on our differences and instead focus on what we all want as humans, which is peace, prosperity, love and joy? We all bleed the same way. Palestinian children are as innocent as Israeli children. When will we stop and resolve our differences to create a better world for all children, Palestinian, Jew, Muslim, Christian, believers, or agnostics? Thank you for listening.